Welcome to episode 3 of the Go to the Field podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Eric Osland,
I'm Ryan Wormer.
and today we're going to have a little bit of a discussion on weed control strategies. So, as we're getting towards the end of the year here and getting into discussions on management strategies for the upcoming growing season, also starting to have some conversations on purchasing and prepay. Thought it'd be a good idea to get into a little bit of strategy on weed control for 2025, especially going into somewhat of a down farm economy that we have. And really, I think that weed control is just one of those areas that I don't feel that farmers can afford to cut costs on. Don't you think, Ryan?
Oh, 100% agree. It's Let's get into that a little bit. Let's get into the importance of weed control. I'm going to throw a little statistics at you as well. So, a couple of big things. Public enemy number one is water hemp, right? So, one water hemp plant can emit 250 or 500 up to 500,000 seeds per plant. So, you talk about creating misery for weed control into the future if we let them survive. And that seed can last in the soil for up to 4 years. So that is a very long time. And then even some of the other ones, if you get outside of water hemp, can last even longer than that. And some of those that can last longer are more of your broadleafs. Your large seeded broadleafs can last longer. And the smaller seeded weeds, they emerge a little bit closer to the soil, but then you get some of the large seeded broadleafs, they can emerge from depths of even 3 inches or below. So you talk about something that's persistent into the soil. It's kind of crazy. And if we do not have good weed control, it leads to this weed bank that we have moving into the future. And it can turn into big money each year. And that money spent on weed control when it could be spent on other things. And here's probably the amazing stats that I think are the biggest, Eric. So this is some work that was done out of Southern Illinois University. So on corn, for every inch of weed growth, while it's in crop, there's 4.6 bushels lost per acre. So if you think about that, well, I guess the other thing is we get big weeds, say they're 6 inch weeds, you've almost lost 30 bushels to the acre. And then say we're in the corn market we are now, right around $4 a bushel. You're looking at $120 per acre that you lost just by letting weeds grow. Then you go into soybeans. So for every inch of weed growth while you're in crop into soybeans, it's 7/10 of a bushel lost per acre. So you think about that back to that 6 inch weeds, if you can even kill them, you're looking at a little over 4 bushels. So $10 soybean market, $40 an acre. So you talk about that. I mean, that's why we're here, right? Is to talk about the importance of having a good strategy going into 2025. I think it's exactly right. You cannot skimp on weed control. It's very imperative you have a good plan.
Yeah, and I think that was a good point. If we can even kill them once they get to 6 inches tall, generally I think we run into a lot more difficulty trying to control those weeds, especially when we're talking about water hemp. So, and going back to that, I think it is going to be a program approach, and some of you guys have probably heard these same theories or same things time and time again. But starting out in the year, we have to start with a clean field. Um, Weed emergence. So on the water hemp side, we generally are going to have water hemp emergence when it gets to about 350 GDUs. So depending on what the weather looks like early in the spring, can kind of depend when that water hemp's going to emerge. If you look across an average of 5 to 10 years, it's going to be around May 17th is when we acquire that 350 GDUs for the season. But one thing that you got to keep in mind is, like in 2024, we did a little calculation here and we found that 350 GDUs was actually acquired on May 7th. So, uh, you know, it's something you got to watch out for. It's not one of those things. Water hemp doesn't care about the date, doesn't care, what time of the year it is. It just cares how warm that soil is and if it's able to germinate and survive.
And I guess thinking about that a little more too, Eric, there may be times, when we're going out there to get the ground ready to plant, we may need to make a burn down application with emerged water hemp before that field's planted or before we even till the field.
For sure. I think that's something that we've run across here over the last few years is when that water hemp is emerged and we're going out to try to till, to use tillage as a method of control for that particular weed. What we often do is we'll turn that soil over, and those clumps of water hemp, of generally smaller water hemp, can just continue to grow on that soil clod, and then we get into the season and we have all kinds of issues because we didn't actually start clean like we initially attempted to. And part of the reason why we've gotten to this point, in my opinion, is some of these vertical tillage tools that have become really popular across the industry, and they do generally a pretty good job of creating a pretty good seed bed. What they don't do a good job of is really breaking up and turning that soil over, and preventing those water hemp from continuing to survive.
It does. You see that tillage tool. It can do a great job and they have their place, no doubt about it. But you get in those situations, I've seen it injure water hemp before. And it seems like not necessarily only water hemp, but other weeds too. And then it just kind of cuts them off. They regrow. And, you even have a harder time controlling it with the herbicides. So as part of this starting clean and staying clean mentality, so with that, I think it's essential to have a good pre-emerge herbicide application. And taking that a little further, Eric, I think the goal is to get multiple modes of action out there to fight against these weeds. I think, we've learned our lesson. If, thinking about history a little bit, if you only use one mode of action for a while, you're going to build some resistance. And then obviously we're going to take more tools out of the toolbox and be in a world of hurt, when it comes to weed control.
Yeah, and I think we already have to some extent. I know the University of Illinois has discovered some Group 15 resistance. So one of our most popular pre-emerge herbicides in the industry would be the Group 15 mode of action. Be your duals and your warrants, Zidua products, and we do already have some resistance that started to develop to those particular herbicides. So diversifying, we oftentimes think about on the post-emergent side, but it's even important on the pre-emerge side as well, to really get that robust weed control that we're looking for. So when we think about timing of these pre-emerge applications, so we have a couple modes of action in the tank, and when do we want to target that application? Generally, I think we want to make sure we're as close to planting as we can be, is going to give us the best success. Sometimes, if we push that application too far forward, if we're a week or two before we actually get the crop in the ground, we can end up with quite a few issues there. Whether it's just a reduced length of residual, or potentially there's weeds that have emerged in between that when we were able to get that field clean and when we got the crop in the ground.
No, ideally, if we can, obviously, an ideal situation, if we can get it as close to planning as possible, that's our recipe for success. But, it's farming, right? We're not in a perfect world. We don't live in a bubble. We got a lot of different weather conditions, a lot of things out of our control, and we're going to have to manage those. So there's certain situations it may call for as in football, I think it's an audible, right? So got to make some calls on the fly and see what we can do. We'll get into that, I think, a little bit later, but let's talk about some of these pre emerge herbicides and then getting some of these multiple modes of action out there. So let's talk about corn specifically. So when we're looking at that, a good pre emerge herbicide, what we're going to find, a majority of them is going to be in the group 15 category. That group 15, you'll probably recognize it as S-metolachlor. Probably there's Bicep, a few other ones that's also in like Lexar, Acuron, some of those products. And then also you're going to have acetochlor, which could be in a full time. It's in degree extra, some of those products as well. Um, And then also a good component is an HPPD, which is a bleaching type of compound. So you're going to recognize those as like mesotrione, timbatrione. Mesotrione is like your Callisto containing products, which is in Alexar, right? And then also timbatrione, which would be in your Laudis, Caprino. Isoxaflutol, is like balance. So you're going to see some of that out there as well. And then also atrazine. So atrazine does a great job. It's been around for a long time, but still helps out with some of these large seeded broadleaves. Having that combination close to planting is going to be ideal for broad spectrum control, not necessarily just something specifically. You're going to get a majority of your small seeded broadleaves and your grasses with that group 15. Your HPPD is going to work specifically on your broadleaves, but it's going to be great big help for your small seeded broadleaves, help out with some of your large seeds, but not a lot. And that's why you need some of the atrazine in there.
Yeah, so I think when you think about some of these programs, like we've ran for quite a few years now, looking at maybe a degree extra or a bicep program, we can really solidify those programs quite a bit just by adding in 3 ounces of a mesotrione, and it's not something that we've always done. Sometimes we've left that mesotrione as more of a post-emergent play, but it really does, like you mentioned, Ryan, it has a lot of value in that pre-emerge situation. So those are some instances where we can kind of help out on that pre-emerge side to make that program just a little bit stronger.
Oh, 100%. The group 15s have been used quite a bit, out there by themselves and asking a load out of those products. I mean, and I think we need to give them a little bit of help. I think sending that group 15 out there by itself is probably not a great practice moving forward. We need to look at that, and I guess how about a lead in for beans right there? So we also use group 15s on soybeans as well. You're going to see that, and whether it's a dual product, a warrant, something along those lines. There's a lot of Anthem Max. Looking at that in Acidua, those are all group 15s. So we are utilizing a lot of group 15s in all of our corn and soybean production now. So if you think about that, that's quite a bit of stress on one active ingredient that we need to maybe switch that up a little bit, then do some things different. Looking at that, it was pretty astonishing to me. Went and seen some bare ground studies. I don't know. It was probably a few years back. I had a person show me what metribuzin brought to the table. So it was insane to me how much extra control you've got on water hemp by just adding metribuzin to a group 15 chemistry. It was really, really good.
Yeah, and then metribuzin, that's one of those products that's been around for a really long time. It's definitely nothing new.
And
It
we're talking metribuzin. You may know it as the product formerly known as Sencor.
Yep, Sencor. But just because it's been around for a long time doesn't mean it still doesn't have value in some of these programs. Another one that on the soybean side of things that can add quite a bit of value is our ALS chemistries. So ALS chemistries, we used them for many years, and quite a while back the water hemp developed resistance to ALS products. So it kind of phased out a little bit. We still used it in some premixes, but the reliance on ALS has definitely diminished quite a bit over the years. Um, and we're not getting a whole lot of activity on water hemp from ALS chemistries, but we do get quite a bit of activity on some of our larger seeded broadleaves. And those larger seeded broadleaves like cocklebur and some others that are group
Morning glory, right?
morning glories,
Yeah, for
exactly.
sure.
Uh, those types of weeds that our group 15s don't do a very good job on. They're just outside of the spectrum of control for those products. We throw it in ALS, and we have some pretty good control of those weeds as well, and those weeds have become quite problematic over the last few years.
For sure. They are starting to make a resurgence, to say it lightly. A lot of cockleburs starting to show up late in the season. And, going back to that ALS chemistry, some of those were collateral damage, from I guess, group 14 chemistries that we used to use. We used to use a lot of authority type products. I guess I'm going to classify those as PPOs, right? So there's authorities, there are some Valors, just and Sharpens in there as well. Some of those PPO products. So what's changed over the last, I'm going to say, I don't know, maybe 5 to 7 years. So in that time frame, everybody realized that planting soybeans early has started yielding good results for them, and there's bushels to be gained. So I think Fred Belo and his group's done a lot of work around this, but soybeans, I think it's after April 23rd, you lose a half a bushel a day for every day that you plant after April 23rd. So you think about that, everybody's trying to capture those bushels. Um, they are astonishing when it comes to weed control. They do come with some baggage, and that baggage is a little bit of burn when you are, early on in the season from an early planting. Beans are slower to emerge. We don't have the GDUs. We're not accumulating them as fast. So, that soybean and the hypocotyl as it's coming through the soil surface can sit in that chemical zone and it burns and then we can actually lose some stand. You know, from planting early, we're actually, reducing our populations anyway to help with standability late into the season. So, if we're reducing our populations and then we've got something out there that could potentially, under the wrong conditions, reduce our populations even more, then we can come up with a pretty thin stand, if we don't watch what we're doing. So, Eric, enough about some of the pre-emerge stuff. Let's get into some of the post-emerge things. And ideally, this is part of the staying clean, right?
Yeah, exactly. We started with the start clean, and now we're going to attempt to stay clean. Uh, Really, our best plan of action was we move into a post pass application is to include our residual product in that pass as well. We want to make sure that you guys have probably heard it before, but we're overlapping those residuals, and sometimes true to the term of potentially we don't even let the weeds come out of the ground before we're putting the next layer of residual down. And it really helps us prevent those weeds from getting out of control. Ryan, you talked at the beginning of the episode about some of these yield loss statistics that are out there as far as how many inches of weeds equate to different levels of yield loss. And it doesn't.
Let's bring that back up. So every inch of weed in corn is 4.6 bushels per acre, and then every inch in soybeans is zero point 0.7. So you're talking some serious loss. So if we're spraying bare ground, it's probably a good day.
Yeah, I think so too. I think, it's not in our nature. Oftentimes I think we want to see the weeds up and we want to see them die. But what might be economically in our best interest is to try to kill those weeds before they even come out of the soil, based on some of that work that was done.
Thinking back, I'm just pretty upset with myself. And you think back in older weed control situations and how much we let some of these weeds grow and how many bushels we took off the table years ago. It's pretty disheartening.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about how often we're out there killing 6 or 8 inch weeds, and we even in the instances where we kill them, we sometimes think that that was a success. But if
Oh,
you,
we did a good job.
yeah, we did a good job. But at the end of the day, if you look at some of the research that's been done, we probably took a good, potentially $80 of profit out of that acre.
I know, and we're better educated now. There's been a lot of work done, so I guess I would feel pretty bad if we didn't put it to work.
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly right.
It can get expensive. We let these weeds go, and then there's a chance that we may not get them killed. We could be targeting 6 to 8 inch weeds, and then we could be making one pass and then the next pass because they didn't die. I mean, we're going to have less control. They're going to survive. That plant's going to put off 250 to 500,000 seeds. If it's a water hemp, others are not as many. That thing's just prolific. But, if we have that many seeds that are out there, if we keep it from coming out of the ground, it can't put 250,000 seeds out on the ground.
Yep, that's exactly right. And we've all been in the situation where we have had 6 or 8 inch weeds out there, and the discussion around how we're going to kill those weeds turns into somewhat of a science experiment. I mean, it really those tank mixes get pretty convoluted in what we all try to do to try to kill those weeds. And if you're just spraying soil, you don't have to worry about it.
100%. It is a science experiment, and we try not to do it very often, so we don't know exactly if it's going to work. So it can get tough. The other thing is, I think we want to bring up, we want to keep that soil bare until that crop can get canopied. So I don't think we probably have given the crop canopy as much credit as it deserves on keeping weeds out. It does a really good job. These chemistries, we can't expect them to last till fall. You
Mm.
know, it's they've only got such a life expectancy out there, and then we need to make sure that we get them out there. We layer these residuals in and do a good job there.
And thinking about when we talk about layering residuals, I think one of the mindsets that maybe could have some success, and I think it will have some success, is instead of spraying weeds based on the inches of how tall that particular weed is, if we took an approach of more spraying on a calendar date. So if we tried to spray perhaps 25 to 28 days after our initial pre-emerge application, maybe in a situation where we planted early, the weeds in the crop are growing a little bit slower, the soil is a little bit cooler, so that herbicide hasn't degraded quite as quickly. Maybe we can get 25 to 28 days in those situations. Um, as we get a little bit later in the season, the soil temp's a little bit warmer. The weeds in the crop are a little bit more competitive at that point. Maybe we can target 17 to 21 days after that pre-emerge application to go in and target that overlapping residual. And ultimately, like we've kind of been discussing, in the best case scenario in that situation is that the soil will still be clean. There won't be weeds up that we're trying to kill, and we're just laying down that next layer of protection to hopefully get us to that crop canopy.
Absolutely. And I think what you're referring to, Eric, just to put it in similar terms, for corn emergence, right? So if we're going in and we're planting that first week in April, and we're accumulating GDUs at a slow rate, there's a possibility that corn may not emerge for 3 weeks. So obviously the corn's not growing very fast, and either are the weeds, So some of those weeds are based on GDUs as well. But if you get a little bit later on in the season, we've got, boy, 85-degree temps, and we're accumulating GDUs quickly. That corn can emerge in as quick as 5 days. So, at the same rate, the weeds are going to be growing well too. If we've got ample amount of soil moisture, stuff's going to be happening fast. So we may need to be out there a little bit quicker. So I think we hit that in the pre-emerge, followed by an overlapping residual, depending on the time frame, whether it's 17 to 21 days, or maybe it's even up to that 28 days or a little later. We'd love for everything to be perfect, but it's not. There's going to be the weather when your back's against the wall and you're planting, and then you get a rain and you can't get your pre down. Let's talk some about that.
So what you're
Or
talking about is basically every year.
yes, every year.
Yeah,
It's the same year every year.
that's right.
So you're going to have a bunch of different situations. There are some, that we get these applications made perfectly, but at other times it doesn't happen. Let's go. Let's start. Let's do it chronologically here. So let's start in that March timeframe and then build our way out a little. So there's been times in March, and I think it was even this last year, we had some pretty good weather. Things were a little bit drier. There may be an opportunity to get some early burn down on, in that March timeframe. If we didn't get, say, our fall application to keep down our winter annuals, we maybe want to get out there early. If the weather's warm, some of those winter annuals are going to be growing, could create a problem of getting a good seed bed next spring. So obviously we want to take those out. So we give ourselves an opportunity to get, work that ground when it's clean and get a good seed to soil, or get a good seed bed and good seed to soil contact. So with that, Eric, you know, we're looking at that. If it's my field, there's a good chance that I'm going to make that application. We probably need to talk about that residual, that we're putting down at that time. I'm not going to put my water hemp control the thing that I'm really banking a lot of dollars on, I'm not going to put that on in March and hope it's going to be there if I have to plant mid May. Maybe we get rained out or something. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, if we're going out and we're going to make that early application in that March timeframe to try to clean up some of those winter annuals, and it's going to help kind of clean up the fields prior to some of that spring field work. Um, Maybe some Roundup and 2,4-D will do the trick to take out the winter annuals, but maybe we throw in 6 to 8 ounces of metribuzin or an ounce of Valor just to kind of suppress some additional weeds from emerging in between that burn down application and planting.
I think you're right. There's multiple products out there that you can use. Like we're talking about the Metribuzin, that can be an add-in. We can also, if maybe it's a cornfield, maybe we're looking at a little bit of atrazine that we put out there, Princep. Um, Another one on soybeans could be Valor. I guess Valor could you could do either corn or soybeans if it's an ounce. Um, so those are some of the products that we can use on that early application, just so we don't try to put our main residual out there and we end up having issues and it runs out of steam about the time we need it, May 17th.
That's right.
Eric, I think another thing it's worth bringing up too that we run into quite often, or not quite often, but it happens, this middle to late May planting. You talked about that last year. I think we had enough GDUs for water hemp to emerge at May 7th, but we've also planted past May 17th normally when we do get some water hemp emergence there. So if that happens, and we don't have any residual chemicals down, we're starting to get water hemp emerged, potential issues staring us in the face there, I think. Um, I think at some of those points, we do need to make an application before we start tillage.
Yeah, 100% we do. You know, kind of goes back to the start clean mindset, and uh, perhaps it's just a gramoxone. You know, maybe make an application of gramoxone to take those water hemp out, or if there's going to be enough time in between the application and planting, we can also use a 2,4-D and Roundup just to clean that up. But I think what we don't want to do is depend fully on that tillage, especially if we have a decent amount of water hemp that have emerged prior to that tillage pass. So that's just something to keep in mind. And again, I think it kind of goes back to a little bit of an issue of for years some of these tillage tools were just a little bit more aggressive than what they are now. They don't quite turn the soil over as much as we need them to take that water hemp out.
Yeah, I think now the water hemp's probably a little more aggressive than the tillage tool.
Hmm.
I don't know how many times I've seen that. Been out there in the spring and then working the ground, and obviously you're not going to work it up to a fine powder all the time. We're going to get some, a little bit, not huge clods, but you're going to get some clods. And when you work that over, there's going to be water hemp out there that's probably, it's going to be less than a quarter of an inch tall, and you're going to roll that clod over and it's going to grow on the bottom side of that. And, it's just going to make its way to the soil surface. And you're going to have a water hemp or potential water hemp issue if we don't get it under control.
Yep, that's exactly right. And then another thing that thinking about some of these situations is making that pre-emerge application versus incorporation. What are we kind of looking at in terms of that?
I know that question has come up quite a bit, and I think people like to have it, worked into the soil. They get it displaced quite a bit. But I still think at that point, you are disrupting the barrier that you could potentially put down for weed control. As that pre-emergence application, you're going to have a nice barrier. And obviously, yes, we do need to get that thing reined in. Majority of the time, it usually takes at least a half inch of water to get those incorporated into the soil. But during the spring, we usually have that. Usually, that is, not too much of an issue. Incorporating too deep at times when you're trying to work weeds out, yes, that can be an issue. It's hard to manage that. You're going to disperse that chemical barrier among 3 inches of soil. And I think you could just lead to more potential issues and escapes at that point. I think another thing to talk about too is when we don't get our pre emerge residual on and, we're going to be out for a few days. Um, Corn, I think, is a little bit easier. If we're out for a week and that corn started to emerge, and I think the best thing that we can do is get out there as quick as possible and get some of these emerged weeds. Because if your corn's emerged, there's a good chance that you're going to have some emerged weeds without any residual down. The best thing you can do is get to the higher end of some of the residual. We'll have to watch that a little bit. There's certain products, I think, a 2/3 rate, when we're putting it post applied, we need to watch that a little bit just so we don't have extra crop response. When that corn is up and then it's growing early on in the season, the weather's a little bit cooler. The cuticle, the tissue of that plant is a little bit softer. Then we need to watch that so we don't throw heavy residuals out there, cause a crop response that's undesirable at that point. Soybeans gets a little bit tougher. We don't have as many tools in the toolbox. And that being the case, Eric, I'm sure you agree with me here, but we need to get on it quick.
Yeah, you can't wait around, and I think exactly what you said. We've lost a lot of options at that point. In corn, we can still use a lot of those pre-emerge products in a post-emerge setting, but we don't have that option in soybeans. So we got to get those weeds killed off while they're small, using, depending on the system you're in, probably some sort of a glufosinate, potentially a glufosinate with 2,4-D. And then at that point, we also need to get some residual out there as quickly as we can. And then at that point, we're basically going to manage it as we would have from the beginning, overlap another residual in 2 or 3 weeks, and just kind of start from there. But yeah, we can't allow those weeds to get any bigger than what they probably already are at that point.
No, it's imperative that we got to burn those weeds down and make sure they are non-existent ahead of that second pass. Just we need to take them out as quick as possible. Do not let them get any size to them at all, or it's over. And then it's then we're just trying to play catch up from there, and that gets super expensive.
Exactly.
Eric, I think we promised to get the information to our listeners and let them get on with their day. So let's wrap this thing up a little bit, and I think it'd be good to just go back through some of these high points that we want to bring awareness around. To me, it is that start clean, stay clean mentality is huge. I think that's one of the bigger things. If we can prevent a water hemp, that's going to put off 250 to 500,000 seeds per plant, if we can prevent that from coming out of the ground, is going to be a good day.
Yeah, and I think that in-season competition as well that we talked about a little bit, and that yield loss that we see with every inch of weed, that's generally not recognized as much as what it probably should be. But keeping those weeds from competing with our crops at all is really important.
Yeah, if you're going to save me $120 an acre on corn or $40 an acre on soybeans, that's a big day.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I think is huge, and this goes, and I'm sure when you're working with your equity salesperson, is a big deal, is to bring up and then, utilizing multiple modes of action, making sure we don't make just the group 15s do all the heavy lifting when it comes to weed control. Looking at that, let's identify what target weeds we have, whether we need to add in maybe an ALS, or something like that to get some of these large seeded broadleafs and soybeans. Make sure that we're putting an HPPD with our corn, whether that's, that timbatrione family or also the mesotrione family, something in that arena to help with water hemp control. And then make sure that we're overlapping these residuals. We're getting a good pre down as close to planting as what we possibly can, understanding there's going to be certain weather situations that prevent you from doing that. But if we can, in an ideal situation, let's get them as close to planting as we can, and then let's overlap these residuals.
All right. Well, thank you for joining this episode of the Go to the Field podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast, and we look forward to bringing you another episode.
See ya.